не может устроить пустой разговор. Пока все, что мы слышим, это разговоры о необходимости придумать какое-то перемирие, и особо не скрывается, что нужно это перемирие для того, чтобы выиграть время для продолжения накачивания Украины оружием, чтобы они привели себя в порядок, дополнительную мобилизацию осуществили и так далее. Перемирие – это путь в никуда. Нам нужны окончательные юридические договоренности, которые будут фиксировать все условия обеспечения безопасности Российской Федерации и, конечно же, законные интересы безопасности наших соседей. Но в контексте, который будет международно-правовым способом закреплять невозможность нарушения.
According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, 217 combat engagements took place at the front line over the past day, on December 25th. In the Kramatorsk sector, Russia attacked 11 times in the vicinity of Stupokny, Chasiv, and Bilahora. In what is perhaps the two hottest and most covered areas of the front, Pokrovsk and Kursk, some recent events have occurred. In Kursk, the Russians are attacking on 3 vectors, each of which could force a large withdrawal of Ukrainian troops if they are successful. The most dangerous area seems to be the offensive toward Malaya Loknya, where the Russians have reached the village of Kruglenkoye, which is a mere 2 to 3 kilometers away. In Pokrovsk, the problems that the Ukrainian defenders seem to face are clearly multifaceted. A very insightful interview on Christmas between a Ukrainian journalist and a Ukrainian lieutenant situated on the southern Pokrovsk front revealed 3 comprehensive problems in their army that has caused the recent Russian breakthrough in the area. One of those issues is something I have mentioned in my last video, that is, the worsening manpower issue. But it is not only due to the Russian attrition, but also because of large-scale desertion. And here's a sneak peek of a quote from the interview. Every month, Ukraine loses from 4,000 to 5,000 soldiers, taking into account the dead, seriously wounded, and those who have abandoned a military unit without authorization. Needless to say that I think this figure of 5,000 a month is a gross underestimation, because recently we saw the Financial Times report which said that about 60,000 Ukrainians had deserted only desertion, not even casualties, from January to October of this year, which would lead to the unescapable conclusion that more than 5,000 Ukrainians have been killed or wounded and deserted in the Ukrainian army for every month of this year. And of course, I can't leave the important topic of the defense of Pokrovsk without highlighting the COPE assessments from the ISW, or the Institute for the Study of War, who seems to think that President Putin has ordered his military not to take Pokrovsk, but advance into the open fields instead. And I will give my comments on their assessment as well. So do me a favor and make sure you hit the notification bell, because the click-through rate on the last 3 videos was lower than usual, which sends a bad signal to the YouTube algorithm. And don't forget to leave some support with a super thanks or super chat donation, and let's get into it. So according to the US Institute for the Study of War, or the ISW, and I can already hear the complaints in the comment section about me using this as a source. Nevertheless, they say that while Russian President Vladimir Putin has likely tasked the military with securing new territories in the east, an assault on well-defended cities such as Pokrovsk could slow down the Russian advance at a critical moment in the Kremlin's pursuit of a geopolitical victory. The report highlights the fact that Putin is increasingly describing the progress of Russian troops in terms of square kilometers, rather than focusing on capturing specific settlements as he did in the past. In light of this, the Institute suggests that Putin has likely instructed the Russian military command to delay the capture of Pokrovsk in favor of advancing through open fields and small settlements. According to geolocation imagery held by the ISW, Russian forces are within 10 kilometers of the administrative border between Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk regions. And if you ask me, I will make 2 comments on this analysis. First, I do not think that President Putin interferes with the military strategy of the Russian army in Ukraine. That was made clear to me with the retreat from Kherson in the fall of 2022, which was no doubt politically embarrassing for him, but militarily necessary. Clearly, President Putin allows his generals full sway over tactical decisions. Second, and I keep having to ask myself this when I read many of these Western reports, how the hell would the ISW's so-called experts sitting in their offices in the West have any clue or know what the real Russian offensive plan is, especially since they have been consistently wrong on this topic? According to the geolocation maps, in recent days, Russian troops have advanced southward within the eastern part of Novo-Vasilivka, southwest of Pokrovsk. One Russian military blogger reported that Russian forces have moved north of Novo-Vasilivka towards Solony and Pokrovsk and are advancing in the direction of Kotlin. Another Kremlin-linked Russian blogger claimed that Russian forces have focused their attacks on Novotoritsky, east of Novo-Vasilivka, and Dashenki, south of Pokrovsk, forcing Ukrainian troops to retreat to the Lasivka-Peshani line, southeast or southern of Pokrovsk. The blogger also stated that Russian forces are advancing from Putsinka and Pushkini, both of which are south of Pokrovsk, towards Ukrainka, southwest of Pushkini. But within the ranks of the Ukrainian armed forces itself, there are a lot of comments on what is going on near Pokrovsk, and they aren't too positive in my opinion.
25 грудня, Покровськ. Результати нещодавнього обстрілу. Ну, все по класіки. Класика російського жанру. Щоб ви розуміли, куди вони попали, гляньте.
Here's an assessment from Roman, a lieutenant in one of the territorial defense brigades of the armed forces of Ukraine, which defends the area south of Pokrovsk. We can count on reinforcements, or at least some reinforcement, only if the media writes about our direction, or the enemy breaks through far into the rear. And there is no need to talk about global changes. I think they will never be there. A Ukrainian journalist who spoke with the lieutenant for about an hour said that he emphasized that the area can be held if a significant number of reserves are transferred there, which have armored vehicles in service and, most importantly, have undergone high-quality coordination. However, the situation south of Pokrovsk is not currently showing any signs of improving. Now, some of you remember my recent report on December 12th about an analysis from a Ukrainian journalist by the name of Yuri Butusov, who reported on a Russian breakthrough near Shevchenko. The Russians had captured an entire fortified area of the armed forces of Ukraine, which the Ukrainian military did not manage to occupy. Literally, 2 days later, the soldiers of the Russian Federation themselves showed photos and videos of the defensive structures they occupied. From the available material, it is clear that this was a well-built bunker, equipped with sleeping places and a supply of provisions, reports the Ukrainian journalist.
Кровати еще нахуй в целлофане, блядь. Бункер во какой нахуй. Охуеть. Окопы ебать.
Roman, the lieutenant, states that the problem is very multifaceted and is far from the first time that it has manifested itself. A similar situation previously developed in the village of Novohorodivka, which was occupied by the Russians in the summer, as well as in other sections of the front near Pokrovsk. Having spoken with Roman and 2 other low-level commanders who hold defenses in this direction, the journalist was able to identify 3 reasons for such miscalculations. First was a lack of clearly established interaction between brigades and battalions responsible for a certain section of the front. Second, the untimely reporting of the situation on the front line due to the fear of individual commanders to report failures to higher levels. Third, a lack of people to hold positions, including due to mass unauthorized abandonments of the military unit, which have acquired a global scale in the past few months. The military is unanimous in the fact that solving these problems through the initiative of individual commanders on the ground is impossible. However, they are cautiously optimistic after the appointment of Mikhailo Drapati as commander of the land forces of Ukraine, and say that if there is the necessary resource, he will be able to correct the situation. However, according to military officials, there is very little room for decision making. To improve the interaction between military units on the front line, only one decision can be made, namely the transition to the divisional structure of the armed forces of Ukraine, says the lieutenant. Thus, due to the increase in the structural military units themselves, such an architecture will be able to resolve most issues regarding interaction on the front line. However, at the same time, it is worth remembering that such a transition itself is a very long and complex procedure that cannot be implemented in a few months or even half a year. It also requires attracting additional resources for training officers, re-equipping units, and systematizing work. Quotations. Here's a conditional example from the lieutenant. We hold one village, and next to it another military battalion of another brigade holds another village. This is not our area of responsibility because we are different military units and have different subordination. And even when we enter into interaction, we may not understand what plans that brigade has. There were cases when some military units simply retreated from their positions, which is why we also had to retreat so as not to be surrounded. And if there was a divisional military structure, we would work as one mechanism, like an orchestra, because now the situation is that we are all just playing together, but each one plays something different, Roman concludes. Another problem that the military speaks of off the record is the command's misunderstanding of the clear situation on the ground. The reason for this is a very long way to convey information from the front line to the commanders who make the final decisions. Very often, brigade commanders, not to mention battalion commanders, are afraid to make decisions even on a tactical scale without the approval of the higher military leadership from Kiev, fearing to take responsibility. It is worth noting that the situation is truly unique. It is no secret that in repelling the Russian offensive in February to March 2022, Ukraine owes much to the initiative of the lower military leadership. Sergeants and lieutenants who led their platoons and companies into battle without waiting for orders from the higher military leadership were able to turn the tide of the battles with the Russians. After all, Russian military units at the time were waiting for communication with higher military leadership in Moscow to resolve any issues. At that time, the Russian Operational Tactical Missile Systems, or the OTMS, Iskander, received an order to strike an hour and a half after detecting potential targets, and the brigade commanders were pawns in the hands of General Gerasimov, who took the next step only if they received an order from the higher military leadership. However, time passed and the trends changed. Now the Russian Operational Tactical Missile Systems Iskander strike 2 to 3 minutes after the detection by intelligence, which means a complete leveling of the entire vertical of issuing military orders. That is, drone operators provide coordinates of the direction to the Russian Operational Tactical Missile Systems Iskander launchers without waiting for approval. The implementation of decisions on assaults in each direction was given to the brigade commanders, who are now personally responsible for carrying out certain actions on the front line. At the same time, it is worth noting that the Ukrainian command is moving in the opposite direction. In addition, it is worth noting that according to sources in the security structures, orders to conduct operational and sometimes even tactical actions on the line of military contact are approved directly by the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Alexander Syrsky. Unfortunately, his decisions are often untimely, and delay is now costing the country a great price, namely the loss of human lives and square kilometers of lost territory. At the same time, brigade commanders and officers of smaller structural units are afraid to make decisions on their own, expecting the great responsibility that they are often threatened with. From the above, an ironic thesis follows, which the head of the Come Back Alive Foundation, Taras Chmut, likes to express. In quotations, a small Soviet army will never defeat a large Soviet army. And there is much more truth in this sentence than it seems at first glance. The third problem that commanders of units in Pokrovsk direction talk about is a large number of unauthorized abandonments of the military unit. It is worth noting that this problem probably has the least options for a possible solution. According to Ukrainian sources in the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, every month, Ukraine loses from 4,000 to 5,000 soldiers, taking into account the dead, seriously wounded, and those who have abandoned a military unit without authorization. It is very difficult to restore such a number of losses at the moment. At the same time, The problem is not only in the direct implementation of mobilization, but also in the quality of the average mobilized military. This is a topic for a separate article, but we will note only one thing, writes the journalist. The existing mobilization indicators are enough only to address tactical threats in the short term, and there is no need to talk about any strategic planning at all now. In the near future, we will see how the three problems listed above will affect the defense of Pokrovsk, a city that has incredible military and industrial importance for Ukraine. What is important to note is that none of the three military personnel interviewed by the journalist answered the question of whether Pokrovsk will be able to be defended if these problems are not resolved. At the same time, the Russians are a mere 8 kilometers from the Pokrovsk-Dnipro highway and is slowly taking it under control of FPV drones. After all, the border with the Dnipro region is exactly the same distance from the forward units of the Russian armed forces. In Kursk, the Western and Ukrainian press continues to double down on the allegations of North Korean troops taking part in the Russian offensive. However, first it is necessary to understand in which main directions the so-called joint Russian-Korean group is attacking, which, according to the Ukrainian side, has about 50 to 60,000 military personnel. Its main goal is to break through to the Sumy-Sudzha highway, which is the main logistics artery for the bridgehead of the armed forces of Ukraine. Russian troops are moving towards it from the southeast direction, where in early December they were able to capture the village of Plehovo, located 13 kilometers from the highway on the east bank of the Sel River. After the capture of this settlement, the Russians were tasked with forcing the water barrier. According to the online map of the Ukrainian think tank Deep State, they succeeded, and now hostilities are already continuing on the west bank of the Sel River near the village of Kurilovka and Makhnovka. Russian resources also write about this breakthrough. For example, the Russian pro-war publication Radovka believes that in the future, the Russian army plans to reach the vicinity of Sudzha near the villages of Goncharovka and Rabanchina. At the same time, the BBC Russian service reports that Russian and DPRK troops are putting pressure on Ukrainians from the opposite left flank. Here, their key goal is to make their way to an important fortified district of the armed forces of Ukraine in the village of Malaya Loknya. In mid-December, they managed to break through into the village of Kruglenkoye. Located 2 to 3 kilometers from Malaya Loknya. Now heavy fighting continues there. If Ukraine loses this fortified district, it will be forced to withdraw its troops from the northern part of the Kursk bridgehead, in particular from the villages of Pokrovsk. Another direction of the Russian offensive is along the Ukrainian border from north to south. Here on the 11th, the Ministry of Defense for the Russian Federation announced that the village of Darino has been taken over. This means that the Russians managed to cross the Snagost River and wedge into the Ukrainian defense. Their next target may be Plehovo, from which it is about 10 kilometers to the Sumy-Sudzha highway. In case of cutting off the logistics, the armed forces of Ukraine will not be able to continue to hold the bridgehead there. 3 powerful waves of the Russian offensive in the Kursk region allowed Russia to recapture about half of the territory, but did not lead to the destruction of the stability of the Ukrainian defense in these key areas. This can be explained by the fact that here the command of the armed forces of Ukraine attracted strong units, in particular airborne assault, and also built a fairly effective system of mine-explosive barriers. Military expert and retired Australian General Mick Ryan notes that despite fierce fighting last week, the Russians managed to win back only a minimum number of territories. How long the armed forces of Ukraine will be able to contain the offensive of the Russian Federation and their alleged allies? BBC sources in the Ukrainian military leadership are sure that they can hold out at least a month in the Kursk region.